Karen Ellis was a confident 41-year-old real estate agent who believed she could have anything she wanted, including 19-year-old Daniel Brooks. But Michelle Dawson, a 43-year-old married mother of two, thought Daniel belonged to her. At 41, she had crafted the image of a confident, independent woman. She wore luxury brands, drove a sleek black Mercedes, and lived in a two-story modern home tucked into a quiet Maryland suburb. Her neighbors knew her as friendly, polished, and perhaps a little too interested in younger men, but nobody judged her openly. Instead, she created an atmosphere he could sink into: soft jazz, scented candles, expensive food, and gentle praise. Soon, he was spending more and more time at her house. Karen took photos of them together, not to share but to keep, in private folders in locked albums. Little trophies of a secret she never wanted to end. She was successful, and success made people polite. She began looking forward to seeing Daniel more than her own husband. He liked the gifts from Karen, the comfort from Michelle. He didn't know how to say no to either of them, and soon he wasn't trying to. She wanted to know who he was with, why he was late, why he was online but not replying. Michelle grew more emotional. She cried during conversations, asked if he still cared about her, hinted that she was falling in love. The pressure from both sides mounted. Daniel started skipping classes. His grades fell. He lost weight. He started seeing them both, Karen on weekday evenings, Michelle on weekends. He told himself he wasn't doing anything wrong. They were older, experienced, and surely they knew what they were getting into. A post of Daniel at a coffee shop she didn't recognize. He never went there with her. And in the reflection of the glass, barely visible, was the faint silhouette of a woman, older, holding his hand. He wasn't leading anyone on. He was just going with the flow. She spent hours picking the right outfit before heading to the gym. She started wearing perfume again, buying makeup again. One weekend, Karen called while he was at Michelle's house. He let it ring, but Karen was suspicious. He said he was in class. She knew he wasn't, another time. Michelle showed up unannounced at the gym during one of his shifts, the same shift Karen had dropped by earlier. Michelle noticed the way Karen smiled at him, the way he looked away. Something inside her was waking up, and Daniel, whether he realized it or not, was the cause. Karen told herself she wasn't chasing youth, she was simply unwilling to settle for boring men her age. He liked the attention, the feeling of being wanted. He was young, flattered, and confused. And neither Karen nor Michelle knew about each other yet. She was a dental assistant, worked long hours, and raised two teenage kids. Her marriage to Brian was safe but stale. They argued often and slept in separate rooms. For years, Michelle buried her frustrations in work and parenting. But when she hurt her ankle slipping on the stairs, her doctor suggested light physical therapy. What had started as harmless flirtation was turning into a dangerous obsession. And the rivalry that would unfold in the shadows of this quiet town was something no one could have predicted. That's how she ended up at the same gym where Daniel worked. That's how she justified her fascination with Daniel Brooks. He reminded her of her youth, of a time when she felt seen and wanted. Their connection was slower to grow, more emotional than physical. Daniel helped her through stretches, encouraged her during rehab, and asked questions about her life. Michelle responded by opening up. She told him about her kids, her marriage, her loneliness. Daniel listened, nodding, offering simple words of comfort. She started baking cookies for him, then bringing him home-cooked meals. Eventually, she offered to drive him home when it was raining. What began as a secret love triangle spiraled into a twisted rivalry marked by stalking, manipulation, and obsession. A tall, lanky college freshman with uncombed dark hair and an easy smile, he worked part-time at a local gym near the college campus. She pretended to be interested in fitness, asking Daniel questions she already knew the answers to. Slowly, he warmed up to her. She learned that he was a first-generation college student from a modest background. He lived in a small shared dorm and worked 2 jobs to pay tuition. That vulnerability made Karen feel powerful, like she could offer him a life he didn't know existed. She began bringing him coffee, then new sneakers, then a smartwatch. Eventually, she invited him to her house just to relax. He was soft-spoken, polite, and rarely made eye contact. Karen first saw him during a property viewing near campus, where he was helping unload boxes for another tenant. She watched him from her car, amused by his awkward movements and the sweat on his forehead. There was something innocent about him, something untouched. She introduced herself under the guise of needing help carrying brochures. He helped, she smiled, and that was the beginning. As both women fought for control over the same young man, jealousy turned to rage, and their quiet suburban lives exploded into a deadly confrontation that would leave one woman dead, the other broken, and Daniel vanished without a trace. Karen Ellis had spent the last 10 years rebuilding her life after a bitter divorce. Daniel had just turned 19. Karen returned to the gym repeatedly. At first, Daniel was hesitant. He'd never been alone with a woman Karen's age, but she didn't push, not right away. But Karen wasn't the only one who noticed Daniel. Michelle Dawson lived just 2 streets away from Karen at 43. Michelle had a different kind of charm, the kind that came from blending into her surroundings. From the beginning, Michelle saw Daniel as more than just a gym staffer. Michelle told herself it was harmless. She was just being kind, but the truth was more complicated. Daniel, for his part, never expected the attention, but he wasn't immune to it either. But the dual life was exhausting. He had to delete texts, hide photos, remember what lies he told. Neither woman said anything to him at first, but their behavior began to change. Karen became possessive. She started asking about his schedule more aggressively. Still, he didn't stop, until Karen noticed something odd on his Instagram. Karen zoomed in. She didn't know who the woman was, but she was going to find out. And once she did, everything would change. The quiet suburban world they lived in, where everyone seemed normal, was about to crack open. Karen became obsessed with finding out the identity of the woman in the reflection. She stared at the zoomed-in image for hours, scanning every detail. The hand on Daniel's belonged to someone older, who he saw, where he went. But Daniel was evasive. He gave short answers, often contradicted himself, and rarely made eye contact. Karen picked up on the nervous energy, the half-smiles, the way he kept checking his phone. She watched from her car as he exited the building and walked toward the street. She looked for the car. It didn't take long. Michelle found her business website, scanned through her listings, and finally saw her photo. It was the same woman from the gym parking lot, blonde, elegant, dressed in designer clothes. She followed Karen's social media accounts. She created a fake profile and began liking Daniel's posts anonymously. She hired a private investigator. She told him Daniel might be in trouble, and she just wanted to make sure he was safe. The investigator quickly uncovered the truth. Within 2 days, he returned with photos of Daniel entering Michelle's home on a Saturday night. One photo showed Daniel carrying a grocery bag. Another showed Michelle, barefoot in a robe, standing at the door with a smile. It had been taken weeks earlier, during a weekend Daniel had claimed to be visiting family. Michelle stared at it in disbelief. She knew now that she had been played, but her pain turned quickly to anger. She saved the image, printed it, and pinned it to her fridge. It wasn't just about Daniel anymore. It was about her pride, her life, her revenge. The final photo was the most damning: Daniel shirtless, sitting on the porch steps, smoking a cigarette, looking completely at ease. She even made a note of the places he visited and tried to trace if Karen had been there too. Instead, she felt a deep, icy calm, the kind of calm that comes when rage is no longer loud but controlled. She knew where Michelle lived. She had her name, her photo, her habits, and she wasn't going to compete. She was going to win. Her phone was filled with screenshots, maps, and notes. A digital diary of obsession disguised as investigation. His phone buzzed constantly. Karen sent long, emotional texts demanding loyalty, accusing him of lying, offering to pay for vacations if he stayed. Michelle sent softer messages, pleading, confused, asking if she had done something wrong. He tried to keep up the lies, but it was wearing him down. He stopped sleeping. He began avoiding both houses and spent more nights alone at the dorm. But the silence only made both women more suspicious. Michelle clicked through every photo she could find, comparing them to the vague reflection in Daniel's photo. It was a match. Everything clicked into place. Karen was the other woman. The Mercedes was parked outside a sleek modern home just 2 streets over from her own. She didn't recognize the house, but the sight of it stirred something in her. It felt too close, too invasive. Michelle parked across the street, watched the house for 20 minutes, and drove off. But she returned again the next day and the next. Sometimes during lunch breaks, sometimes late at night. She began learning the woman's schedule: when she left, when she returned, when the lights turned off. A black Mercedes pulled up beside him. The window rolled down. A blonde woman smiled from the driver's seat. Daniel looked shocked, then quickly got in. Michelle's stomach dropped. That was no friend. That was someone who had been in his life long enough to make him feel guilty. Her instincts screamed that something was wrong. One afternoon, she followed him after work. She waited outside the gym in her parked car and trailed him from a distance. Daniel didn't go home. Instead, he walked 3 blocks to a silver SUV waiting at the corner. A woman was behind the wheel. She had imagined a deep, emotional bond with Daniel, something rare and fragile, something that made her feel alive again. And all along, he had been sharing himself with someone else, someone richer, flashier, and colder. It felt like betrayal layered on top of humiliation. The fingernails were painted red, and a gold wedding band was faintly visible. That detail enraged her. Whoever this woman was, she was married, and yet clearly pursuing Daniel in public, where anyone could see. Karen felt a surge of jealousy and betrayal, emotions she hadn't experienced this intensely since her divorce. But this wasn't just heartbreak. This felt like competition, and she wasn't about to lose. Her first step was subtle. She started asking Daniel small questions about his weekends. Karen lowered in her seat and watched as Daniel opened the passenger door, smiled, and got in. The woman leaned over and kissed his cheek. Karen's heart raced. She took a photo of the SUV's license plate and followed them as they drove to a small diner just outside of town. She parked nearby, watching through the window as they laughed over a meal. The woman was attractive, well-groomed, and looked to be in her 40s. Karen clenched her fists as she watched them hold hands across the table. That was the moment she realized this wasn't just a fling, it was a rival. Meanwhile, Michelle sensed something had changed. Daniel was quieter during their meetups. He checked his phone more often, declined her offers to stay the night, and once even called her Karen by mistake. The name meant nothing to Michelle then, but it stuck in her mind. When she asked him about it, Daniel stammered and blamed it on a friend from college. Michelle let it go, but the seeds of suspicion had been planted. She started noticing other small things: new clothes she hadn't bought him, a faint scent of unfamiliar perfume on his shirts, and once a strand of blonde hair on his hoodie. One evening, Michelle waited for Daniel outside the gym. The next day, Michelle drove around the area, retracing the streets near the gym. She looked up the address online and found the name: Karen Ellis, a real estate agent with no kids and no husband. Michelle was furious. She felt like a fool. But Michelle wasn't the kind of person to confront someone head-on. Instead, she gathered information. Karen, on the other hand, decided it was time to take control. Karen printed the photos and placed them in a drawer in her study. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. Daniel, caught between both women, started to feel the weight of the deception. One night, Michelle received a message from a blocked number. It was a photo of Daniel and Karen together at a beach resort. And on a quiet suburban street, just blocks apart, 2 women prepared to destroy each other for the same boy, while the boy himself had no idea how far they were willing to go. Michelle's rage festered like an untreated wound. The picture of Daniel and Karen on the beach was burned into her thoughts. It wasn't just proof of betrayal, it was humiliation written in high definition. She left small hints for Daniel: a perfume she hadn't worn in months. A handwritten note slipped into his backpack, photos from their earlier times together. She hoped to stir guilt, maybe even reignite what they had. But Daniel's replies became shorter. His visits were spaced further apart. Sometimes he wouldn't show up at all. When she called, he said he was studying. The warmth. The feeling of being needed without strings. He wasn't there. Then she called hospitals. Still nothing. Her panic turned to suspicion. She knew Michelle must be involved. She drove to Michelle's house that night and parked across the street in the shadows. She waited for hours, watching. No sign of Daniel. At 2:13 a.m., she stepped out of the car and walked up to Michelle's porch. She didn't knock. Instead, she placed a small bouquet of wilted flowers on the welcome mat, tied with a black ribbon. One evening, without telling either woman, he packed an overnight bag and drove 2 hours to his cousin's place in another town. 10 years earlier, Karen had been the subject of a quiet investigation involving a younger man who accused her of stalking. The case was dropped, but the whispers remained in public forums. She also discovered posts on real estate review sites hinting that Karen had unhealthy attachments to male clients. The meaning was clear. She also sent an anonymous tip to Karen's employer referencing her questionable relationships with younger men. When Michelle saw her car parked outside the dorm, something inside her broke. She waited in her own car watching the dorm lights. When Karen finally emerged an hour later, Michelle followed. Daniel couldn't walk down the street without scanning for one of them. He avoided the gym, skipped class. He even considered transferring schools, but it was too late. He was already a target in a war between two women who had made him the center of their obsession. Karen wasn't fired, but the gossip began to circle. Clients became distant. A promotion she had expected was quietly withdrawn. She knew Michelle was behind it. She didn't have proof, but she didn't need any. Her rage was now personal. A warning. Within days, she had Michelle's daily routine mapped out. How seen, she lit a candle and watched it flicker. Then she made a decision. She wrote a letter, handwritten, emotional, unfiltered. She confessed everything. Her affair, her feelings, her fears. She placed it in an envelope with Daniel's name and drove to his dorm. Work, home, groceries, gym. She noted when the children left for school, when Michelle walked her dog, even when she watered her plants. The investigator also uncovered a few of Michelle's secrets. She had a past affair with a coworker, an unresolved shoplifting charge from her 20s, and a few angry social media posts aimed at other women in her neighborhood. A declaration of war. He shut off his phone. For 48 hours, no one could reach him. She logged every sighting, every car parked nearby, every unfamiliar face. She also started carrying her small revolver everywhere, even inside the house. She created a burner social media profile and began messaging Daniel anonymously. She sent the picture of Michelle in the robe, opening the door to him, followed by captions like, "This is who you trust. And she's married. What does that make you?" Daniel never responded to the messages, but he read them. Karen could tell from the timestamps. The seeds of doubt were planted. Her husband, Brian, noticed the shift. Michelle had grown paranoid, irritable, and distant. She locked herself in their bedroom at night and deleted every call log. When he confronted her, she accused him of spying. The marriage crumbled in silence. When she texted, he left her on read. Her desperation deepened. She imagined Karen laughing, thinking she'd won, thinking she could just take whatever she wanted. But Michelle wouldn't allow it. She now had evidence of Daniel's involvement with Michelle, and she used it strategically. She never directly mentioned it to Daniel, but her tone changed. She reminded him of what she'd done for him, paid his bills, bought him things, offered him a better life. She let him know, without saying a word, that she could take it all away just as easily, and Daniel felt the pressure. Every gift from Karen became a weight. Every moment with Michelle became a risk. Not this time, not again. In her mind, Karen wasn't just a rival. She was a thief, a woman who had intruded into her carefully hidden fantasy and turned it into a lie. At first, Michelle tried to reclaim control through subtle acts. Karen, meanwhile, operated from a place of quiet power. The control Karen exerted wasn't just financial, it was psychological. She began planning future trips and hinted at enrolling him in online courses she would fund. She promised him connections in her business, even employment in her agency. All he had to do was be loyal. Stay away from distractions, stay away from Michelle, but Daniel was trapped. He missed the comfort Michelle gave him. When Karen noticed his phone was off, she panicked. She called the dorm, no answer. She drove to the gym. Michelle found it the next morning. Michelle didn't report it. She knew what Karen wanted to provoke a reaction. Instead, she began keeping a detailed journal. Karen, meanwhile, continued her surveillance. She hired a different investigator not to follow Daniel this time, but Karen now had leverage. Michelle, in the meantime, started her own investigation. She remembered the name Karen Ellis and began researching her. What she found disturbed her. Michelle printed everything. She compiled a folder titled Ellis Evidence and tucked it under a loose floorboard in her closet. The quiet suburb where all three of them lived began to feel like a trap. Late one night, Michelle sat alone in her living room, staring at a framed photo of Daniel. She remembered how safe he made her feel, but Karen was already there. She had come to demand clarity, to offer Daniel a final choice. No more letters. No more games. Something had to end. And someone would make sure it did. The following morning began like any other in the quiet Maryland suburb. Lawns were trimmed, sprinklers buzzed, and neighbors waved politely from driveways. But beneath the calm, a storm was brewing, silent and irreversible. Her visit to Daniel's dorm had gone better than expected. She had told him about Michelle's past selectively edited details from what her investigator had dug up. She didn't scream or accuse. She watched as Karen entered her home, completely unaware. Michelle texted him constantly apologies, questions, desperate attempts to reconnect. Her confidence from earlier in the week began to unravel. She wondered if she had pushed too hard, exposed too much. She tried to distract herself by focusing on work, but her energy was off. Clients noticed. She canceled showings, missed emails. She wasn't expecting anyone. She looked through the peephole and froze. Michelle stood there, calm and still, her eyes locked on the door. At night, she stayed up scrolling through her camera feeds. She turned on all the lights and sat in her living room with the television on mute. Outside, the wind rattled the hedges. Every sound made her flinch. Around midnight, her security system beeped, motion detected in the backyard. Karen bolted upright and checked the cameras. No one was there, just shadows. But she didn't feel alone. She turned off the lights and watched from the window. She barely left the house. She told her coworkers she was taking time off. She cleaned obsessively, reorganized everything, and rehearsed what she would say if Michelle confronted her. And nothing in their lives would ever be the same again. She rehearsed what she would do, how she would respond. Where she would shoot if she had to, still nothing. But she didn't sleep that night. She reached for her phone, ready to call the police, but stopped. If she did that, she'd lose her position of power. Michelle would win. Instead, she pressed the intercom button and asked what she wanted. Michelle didn't respond. She just kept staring. After a full minute, she turned and walked back to her car. She had installed new motion sensors and upgraded her home surveillance system after finding that bouquet of flowers on her porch. She didn't know who left it, but she assumed it was Michelle. It didn't matter now. She was prepared. All were ignored. Karen called him twice. When he didn't pick up, she left long voicemails filled with reassurances and veiled warnings. The silence was suffocating. Two women, both respected in their community, now embroiled in a private war over a boy half their age. Karen didn't care about gossip. She cared about winning. But Michelle didn't seem fazed. In fact, she appeared more composed than ever. She stopped stalking Karen's house. She stopped texting Daniel. She stopped showing any outward signs of obsession. But that calm exterior masked a storm underneath. For the next hour, Michelle didn't move. She didn't cry or shake. She simply stared. A cold, focused stare. That night, she returned home and began preparing. Where the cameras were blind, she waited for the right night, watching weather patterns, monitoring neighborhood noise levels. She practiced loading and unloading the revolver until her fingers moved without thought. She began writing another letter, but this one was different. It wasn't for Daniel. It was for her kids. She began researching Maryland's Stand Your Ground laws. She cleared her browser history after each session. Her mind wandered to dangerous places. No return address. Inside was a single photograph. Daniel, shirtless, asleep in Karen's bed. His arm was wrapped around a pillow. The timestamp on the photo was recent just 3 days earlier. Michelle stared at it for a long time, her pulse rising slowly. She didn't scream or cry. She placed the photo on the counter, went upstairs, and changed clothes. She put on black jeans, a hoodie, and sneakers. She tucked the revolver into her bag and walked out the door. She imagined scenarios, tested outcomes in her head like puzzles. One night, she opened the letter she had written to Daniel and tore it into pieces. The time for explanations was over. Instead, she acted calm, patient, rational. She painted Michelle as unstable, obsessed, dangerous. Karen played the long game. She positioned herself not as a rival, but as Daniel's only real option. She reminded him of what she had done for him, what she could still do. Her tone was gentle, her words like poison dressed as comfort. Michelle had spent the night driving aimlessly after seeing Karen at Daniel's dorm. He didn't want a confrontation, but he didn't stop her either. That silence was enough for Karen. As she left, she felt certain she had finally taken control, that Michelle would fade out of the picture, bitter and broken. Karen had no idea she was being watched. Her hands gripped the wheel so tightly her knuckles turned pale. She hadn't dropped off the letter. Instead, it sat on the passenger seat, unread. She had intended it to be a goodbye, or at least a plea for honesty, but now it felt like a joke. Karen had gotten there first, again. Michelle returned home at dawn and sat in her kitchen, lights off, staring at the blank walls. Her house was no longer a sanctuary. Her husband had moved into the guest room weeks ago. Her children barely spoke to her. She couldn't remember the last time the house felt warm. Everything was slipping away. She opened the drawer where she kept the revolver. She hadn't touched it in days, but just knowing it was there gave her a twisted sense of control. This wasn't about fear anymore. It was about power. Karen, on the other hand, felt victorious. Daniel had said little in return. He nodded, rubbed his eyes, looked away. Michelle had followed Karen back to her house, staying 2 cars behind. She parked half a block away and waited. The next few days unfolded with a tense, eerie quiet. Daniel didn't reply to either woman's messages. He stopped showing up to the gym altogether. Karen became restless. Michelle wasn't sleeping either. Her nights were spent reviewing everything she knew about Karen: the photos, the home address, her schedule. Then, one afternoon, Michelle received a package on her porch. Karen was at home when her doorbell rang. Karen didn't open it. She backed away slowly, her heart pounding, but Karen wasn't fooled. That wasn't a retreat. That was a signal. Later that night, Karen double-checked every lock in the house. The next day, she filed a restraining order against Michelle. The news spread quickly among neighbors. Whispers started. Rumors brewed. Michelle was planning something final. She had mapped out Karen's house in detail. She knew which windows stayed open, which doors creaked. Karen sensed something coming, but didn't know when. Neither woman knew that the end was already in motion. And when it came, it would happen quietly, suddenly, without warning. A single knock. A moment's decision. The neighborhood was silent when Michelle pulled up to Karen's house just after midnight. The air was thick and humid, the kind that clung to skin and made breathing feel heavier. Inside was the revolver, wrapped in a towel, cold and heavy. She hadn't spoken to Daniel in days. Her last text had gone unanswered. She kept the security feed open on her iPad, watching the grainy images flicker in black and white. She walked straight to the front door and rang the bell. She considered calling the police, but her phone was across the room. The silence outside felt unbearable. Then, a sudden bang, something hitting the door. Not a gunshot, a fist. Karen flinched. She pointed the pistol at the door, finger trembling. The sound was deafening in the quiet street. She cried out, crawling backwards into the house, leaving a trail of blood across the hardwood floor. Michelle stepped forward, staggered from her wound, but still upright. Her gun pointed downward now, shaking in her hand. She collapsed just inside the doorway, her body landing with a heavy thud. Blood pooled around her like a spreading shadow. She was rushed to the hospital, stabilized in surgery, and kept under watch. Michelle was pronounced dead at the scene. A single bullet had pierced her lung, and she had bled out within minutes. One shot, phone disconnected. Accounts deleted. Some believed he moved out of state. Others said he changed his name. And a neighborhood forever stained by a night it could never forget. A few rumors even suggested he'd joined the military just to escape. No one knew for sure. But his absence became part of the legend. the boy at the center of a storm who walked away untouched. Detectives reviewed footage from Karen's security cameras, but a critical section was missing. The shooting, as bloody as it was, fit the textbook definition of self-defense. Karen was not charged with murder. She did, however, face scrutiny from the public. The media picked up the story, turning it into a sordid scandal of obsession, lust, and rivalry. Reporters camped outside her home for weeks. She eventually sold the house and disappeared from the town where she once held status. The feed had been manually erased just the few minutes around the time of the shooting. Karen claimed she didn't know how it happened. Her name was quietly removed from online business listings related to her old agency she kept to herself. Her husband, once numb, later filed a wrongful death suit against Karen. It was settled in private. Her children rarely spoke about what happened. In the years that followed, the house remained empty for a long time. Locals whispered about it. Some believed Michelle had lost her mind. Others blamed Karen. No one mentioned Daniel's role aloud, but everyone remembered. The wound on her shoulder left a scar she covered with clothing. But the deeper scars, the ones no one saw, and much longer. The digital logs showed the deletion came from her tablet. She blamed a software glitch. No one believed her, then another. Another bang, louder, a crack in the wood, then she waited. Karen didn't answer. She looked through the peephole, breath shallow. Michelle stood there, looking directly into the lens. She didn't shout, didn't move, just stared. The motion light outside the front porch blinked on. She sat up straight. A shadow appeared just outside the frame. Karen reached for the pistol she had placed beside her on the table. Michelle stood with her arms at her sides, her eyes calm but wild. Her heart thudded once, hard, then again. She stood up slowly, her eyes never leaving the screen, her vision blurred. Her shoulder throbbed. She could feel warm blood pooling beneath her. She looked up and saw Michelle leaning against the doorframe, her face pale, her mouth twitching like she wanted to say something, but no words came. He had vanished. His social media was wiped. His phone rang twice before going straight to voicemail. It had begun to dawn on her that he might be gone for good, and she didn't know how to handle it. All the power, all the control she thought she had, felt empty now. He had slipped through her fingers. Her footsteps made no sound on the pavement. As she walked, her eyes stayed on the house. Second window to the left, Karen's bedroom. Porch light still on. Curtains drawn. Michelle paused at the base of the driveway, scanning for cameras. She knew where most were placed. She had studied them for weeks. Still, she moved carefully, avoiding the center of view, hugging the side of the house. The streets were empty. No dogs barking, no porch lights flickering on. Her silver SUV came to a slow stop half a block away, headlights off. She sat behind the wheel for a moment, looking at the small, modern home that had become the focus of her fury. She wasn't nervous. She felt strangely calm. The kind of calm that comes when a decision is already made. She stepped out quietly, a black hoodie covering her face, a small bag hanging off her shoulder. Inside, Karen was still awake. She sat in her living room, staring at her phone. The restraining order against Michelle had given Karen some brief satisfaction, but it didn't bring peace. Michelle moved up the steps without hesitation. She didn't try to hide. Karen backed away from the door. She raised the gun with shaking hands. Without thinking, Karen pulled the door open, gun raised. Neither of them spoke. The moment stretched. Karen screamed something wordless and sharp and fired once. Michelle stumbled back. Blood bloomed on her hoodie, but she didn't fall. Her right hand shot up, gun raised. Karen dropped to the ground, a bullet slicing into her shoulder. Sirens were already on the way. Neighbors had heard the shots, but inside the house, time moved differently. Karen reached for her phone, dragging herself toward the couch. Then Michelle dropped her gun. It clattered to the floor and slid across the room. Her knees buckled. By the time the police arrived, Karen was barely conscious. The investigation that followed was messy. Still, the police couldn't prove intent. Karen had a restraining order in place. Michelle had shown up with a weapon. Daniel Brooks became a ghost. After the shooting, he never returned to college. His dorm was cleared out within days. Karen eventually resurfaced in another city under a new real estate brand. She no longer posted on social media. Michelle's family buried her quietly, far from the media glare. The story became local folklore, a tale of jealousy, manipulation, and how quickly love turns into something monstrous. Two women destroyed by obsession. One young man who disappeared into silence.